Professor Fulton Miller. I am excited to show you some watercolor techniques that I think you're going to need next week. We're going to be pretty spaced out when we're in the studio, so I'm not going to be able to be with everybody the entire time. So I thought that making a just quick video showing how to work with a couple of different watercolor techniques might be helpful. You are welcome to copy what I do in this video. You are welcome when you come over here to paint whatever you would like to paint. But I just thought I'd show you a little bit about how to use watercolors. Sound good? Sounds good. Okay, so here we go. Starting to add a little water to my colors. You notice I don't actually touch the palette when I'm dripping water in. And then I'm taking what should be fresh water and adding it to my paper. Now, I did a warm-up exercise and I left a little purple on my brush. I should have cleaned a little bit better, but it's fine for my purposes. It actually fades in quite a bit, and I'm actually going to have a little bit of purple within this design anyway. Now, what I'm preparing this paper for is a part of watercolor called wet and wet. So you either paint wet paint into water like I'm doing here, or sometimes you put down wet paint and then you add more paint, maybe in different colors or in more saturation, less water on top of that. And what this gives you is a really soft effect. So you don't end up with really sharp lines, you end up with areas that bleed into each other. And you can already see that kind of happening with what I'm doing. Now some of the paint went in a little bit, maybe too saturated. So I'm starting to spread it out into the other wet areas. If I'd added a little bit more water onto my paper, it may have just bled completely out on its own, but it'll still bleed even from here. So what I'm working on here is a sunset. And when I think of a sunset, you have yellow at the bottom, it goes up to orange, maybe violets, and then blue. Okay, so I'm starting to add a little orange at the top. And then I drag some of that orange down and blend it just a little bit with the yellow. More orange going in. This whole area is wet. I didn't wet the whole paper. I actually left some areas dry so that I could create areas of clouds and brightness that I don't necessarily want to fill in. Okay, so see how it's bleeding here? That's wet and wet. It's going to give me a lot of softness when it dries. I have sped this video up a little bit. I do not paint this quickly. So if you're not painting this quickly, it's totally fine. I'm just trying to keep it fast for your attention's sake. Right, and then I'm bringing in just little bits of purple into the top. And what I'm using the purple for is really defining this orange and yellow area. I want it to look a little bit like maybe a cloud in a sunset. And so surrounding that yellow and orange is kind of bringing in maybe kind of like a background sky. I'm also using a sponge to just dot some of it out. So you're not necessarily fully committed at this stage to what you lay down. Whatever you put into your watercolor will stain the paper. But if it's a little too dark, you can use a paper towel, or you can use, I was using a sponge. You can also use Q-tips if you like, to pull some of that color out. So I wanted to make some areas lighter. Since we're going to be painting in a limited time, sometimes I would bring in more color on that top part, but I would allow it to dry for several minutes in between. Sometimes I actually use a hair dryer to make this happen, but instead I'm using my time wisely by going down below, and I'm going to create sort of a water scene. And thinking about the purple in the sky, I'm thinking how that reflects from the purple up above to maybe purple and deeper, darker water down below. And this is actually painting wet paint on just dry paper. So I've really wet my paint. I have a good saturation. I've put a lot of the paint like within my brush. and it gives me these darker, richer tones of purple. And I didn't worry necessarily when I was painting this about, having it perfect. And you don't have to either. Just put some lines across, drag them around. You'll also notice that I've let some of my paint bleed onto the table. That's also fine. I'll be cleaning up the tables anyway. Okay, as my top dries, you notice how soft it's gotten, like it's kind of bled all across. There's some control where the yellow stayed, where the oranges stayed. Once that's dried a little bit, I can actually go in and add in a little more saturated color. Now this is not fully dried, it's still going to create sort of a soft effect. As long as your paper's wet, you're not going to get really sharp lines, areas of detail. It's going to bleed. But I want that look. I just want a little bit more color. I want to define some things subtly, not in a way where it looks too terribly cartoonish. I will tell you all that I didn't really have a plan necessarily for this other than I think I'm going to make maybe some clouds, a sunset, and some water. Like I said, you guys can paint really whatever you want to do. This is just showing you some techniques that you can try. Adding in more areas of saturation, and then also bringing some of those colors that I put up into those clouds into those reflective areas in the water down below. Now notice when I'm using my brush down below, I'm kind of keeping this horizontal line going. When you think of water, remember when we talked about, kind of areas of line, creating sort of emotional sensations. When you paint, water is usually pretty horizontal, unless if you're looking at a wave up close. So when I put in my horizontal lines, it gives it that feeling of rest that I would see in a still body of water. A little bit of yellow. This is also giving that top area a little more time to dry. If you work in different sections, you can accomplish more all at once in one sitting. Maybe bringing in a little bit more of that color into that white area. I could just leave that as is. It could be where the sun is sitting, and so the sun is so bright that I have completely white light. But thought I'd bring in a little bit more of that yellow, define it a little bit more. Okay, now that I've allowed my painting to dry a little bit, I decided to take kind of a, I don't want to call it a cheater's way around adding detail, but this is a popular way of bringing in something that's much more contrasty and defined. You can do this with really small brushes and actual black watercolor or different stains of watercolor, but to save time, and especially since we'll be on limited time in class, after the whole thing had dried, I just went back in and started adding in little details of a shoreline in pen. And I've spent a lot of time, most of the time I've spent on the coast, looking at maybe kind of a scene like this has been in Mexico, looking across to Cancun. So I thought about what the shoreline looked like there. You might see little hints of buildings, jungle areas, and I'm keeping it really small, but there's no reason why you can't go bigger on this. And if you don't want to use a pen, you can use a marker. You could even use an acrylic paint to paint in these little details. Gel pens, you could cut out pieces of paper and overlay. And I'm just bringing in some quick, stronger contrast. So if you want something like this in your design, there's no reason why you can't draw or paint with a different material over your watercolor. For art appreciation, we don't have to be watercolor purists. Nothing wrong with being a watercolor purist, but this is quick, it's easy, it's a good way to get, those 20 points that you need for class. And this is basically it, folks. This is all you need to do. Like I said, you can copy me directly It's totally fine to do. If you want to be creative or more creative with it, you're welcome to do that as well. It's no set rules here. Experiment with it. Try it out. Give it your best.